Good morning, everybody. I am pleased to welcome you to this event and to welcome our speakers and those watching from home. I'm Sarah Abrevaya Stein. I'm the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Director of the L&D Levy Center and a Professor of History at UCLA and the holder of the Viterbi Family Chair in Mediterranean Jewish Studies. And on behalf of the center, I'm very pleased and excited to invite you to our inaugural event of the academic year 2020-2021, a year in which, of course, nothing at all is normal. The Levy Center will be, at least until January of 21, conducting all our programming online in accordance with UCLA directives and in the interest of protecting the health of our community. And we have scheduled for you a series of stimulating, cutting-edge live webinars, of which this is the first, including a year-long series on the topic of Jewish studies, race, and anti-racism, which this event opens. You will also find that we have a program of novel conversations on emerging scholarship in the field. And you can learn more about these programs in our annual newsletter and through our e-flyers. And if you wish to receive these and do not, please email us at cjs@humnet.ucla.edu. And of course, we welcome you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. I want to open the event with some words of gratitude and also words of grief. First, all UCLA events begin by acknowledging that were we meeting on the campus of UCLA, we would be standing on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Tongva peoples. And we thank them for their stewardship and pay our respects, even though, notwithstanding the fact that we are chiming in here remotely. My second bit of gratitude goes to the staff of the Levy Center, who have worked miracles in executing programming for the year to come and in producing a wonderful newsletter, which you can now see online and you will expect in your mailboxes too. So the warmest thanks, as always, to Vivian Hollenbeck, Dr. Carolyn Luce, Chelsea White, Raina Chung, and David Wu for all that you do for the center every day. Now, this teach-in was the result of a series of conversations by a planning committee that included myself, Carolyn Luce, Michael Rothberg, Aomar Boum, Max Greenberg, and Ben Ratskoff. And we convened this summer in response to the encouragement of a number of our center-affiliated graduate students who appealed to the center over the summer to deeply engage with the moment of abolitionism that was initiated by the Movement for Black Lives, or hashtag Black Lives Matter, BLM. Our center's affiliated faculty advisory board immediately seconded this sentiment. And as a result, we are emerging in a year of self-reflection on the question of Jewish studies, race, and anti-racism, themes that our community of scholars is already strongly invested in, but which of course matter so much to us today as individuals, as teachers, as an academic field, and certainly as a society as a whole. And I said a moment ago that I would begin with gratitude and with grief. And it is here that I think it is timely and necessary to say that yesterday's news that the killers of Breonna Taylor will walk free reminds us of the urgency of this conversation, which of course extends far beyond the academic walls, far beyond our field. And it reminds us that the scholars of Jewish studies and the scholars of UCLA represented on this webinar today, we are all operating within a national context in which there is a structural commitment to racism and anti-Blackness that we have a obligation to work against. Now that said, today's teach-in has a broad agenda. For the panelists represented here, work on myriad historical and contemporary contexts in which both race, racism, and Jewishness themselves have various complicated and shifting meanings. And it is our goal to discuss these meanings with you today and to speak with each other and with you about how we approach the themes of Jews, race, and racism, both in our scholarship and in the classroom. Now, I want to offer just a few logistical words on the nature of this event. Because we have only 75 minutes together today, the conversation will be limited to being among the speakers invited today, without time for extensive dialogue with the larger public who is watching us. As a result, we have disabled the question and answer and chat features. But should you have any technical problems, please do turn to our Facebook page or email us at cjs@humnet.ucla.edu, and you can find this address in the chat bar. Center staff will be monitoring the chat, and we reserve the right to remove anyone from the Zoom room who does not comport with our expected norms. Now, while I said that we do not have time to engage in a dialogue with those watching today, our hope is that this teach-in is a beginning. We hope it inspires conversation among the group, with you, and perhaps may encourage other centers, programs of Jewish studies nationally and beyond to help us, join us in taking this conversation further. So now it's my pleasure to turn to introductions. And after that, I will happily turn the proverbial podium to my colleagues. This teach-in on Jewish studies, race, and anti-racism is kindly moderated by my colleague, Dean Franco, Palmer Professor of Literature and the Director of the Humanities Institute at Wake Forest University, where he teaches on comparative race studies. Dean's publications include the 2019 monograph, The Border and the Line, Race, Literature, and Los Angeles, and 2012 book, Race, Rights, and Recognition, Jewish American Literature Since 1969. Lila Corwin-Berman is Professor of History at Temple University, where she directs the Feinstein Center for American Jewish History and is a fellow at the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania for the academic year now in session. She is author most recently of The American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, The History of a Multi-Billion-Dollar Institution. Aomar Boum is Professor of Anthropology and in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at UCLA and Vice Chair of Undergraduate Studies in Anthropology. Sultan Doughan is postdoctoral fellow at the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies at Boston University, an anthropologist by training. Her work deals with racialization of religious difference in secular governance. She has conducted her research in civic education projects in Berlin, funded to combat Islamic extremism and anti-Semitism through the memory of the Holocaust. Ben Ratskoff is doctoral candidate in comparative literature at UCLA and also teaches in the History and Religious Studies departments at Occidental College. His writing has appeared in Jewish Studies Quarterly and Studies in American Jewish Literature, as well as in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Truth Out, and Jewish Currents. He is founder and editor-in-chief of the wonderful online publication, Protocols. Last but certainly not least, Max Greenberg is a PhD candidate in the Department of Chicano, and Central American Studies at UCLA. He thinks, writes, and teaches about Jewish histories, settler colonialism, and race between the United States and Mexico. Thank you all so very much for joining us for what I think is a really path-breaking and exciting event. And I am so grateful to Dean for agreeing to moderate, and I now turn the table to him.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you for everybody who's attending, and thank you to the panelists. We're going to begin with one question that I'd like all the panelists to address at large, as you see best. And I want to remind people who are watching, panelists are going to address questions based on their research, their disciplinary training, and their experience in the classroom. So we'll have a range of answers based on common questions. The first question is, how does your scholarship or your teaching involve themes of race, racism, or anti-racism? Why don't we start with Sultan?
Yeah, thank you, Dean, for that question. Well, you know, this is a tricky question for me. I mean, race is certainly in my scholarship, but it took me some time to understand that race is something that is not named in my fieldwork and among my interlocutors. So I had to actually spend some kind of intense time understanding what is there when it's not named, and also like really trace the workings of race when it's actually not explicitly referred to. So I had to make it explicit, and my scholarship is really about making race, the workings of race, explicit in a kind of context after race. And that's what I try to do with my scholarship, to show like, okay, what is this thing, race, when it's actually officially not there, but it's still organizing device in how different groups come into being in Germany and how they refer to themselves, and to ideas of citizenship, to ideas of like, you know, liberal subjectivity, to notions of being German, being Muslim, being Jewish. So what I try to do with this term itself is I try not to go with the concept and then just like look at what's going on, but like really engage with the experiences in my scholarship. And that's also like what I do when I teach, that I, you know, try to direct students to like, okay, what is being described here and how could we conceptualize this in terms of race or, you know, racism.
I'll go ahead. So thanks, Dean, and thanks, Sarah and the Alan D. Levy Center for this invitation. I would like to answer this question by actually reading a few comments that I prepared specifically for this question, because I deal with a lot of issues, not only related to Sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa as well as North Africa, but I'm trying to also to figure out a way how to see this ethnic also and religious diversity in the context of not only Blackness, given the number of interviewees that I've talked to who happens to be from a what we call in that part of the world Harapins, who are descendants of slaves, or even free slaves. So I have to admit that I rarely talk about this question for personal reasons, but given the recent work that I've been timidly approaching related to a biography about my father, I started figuring out a way how Jews and Muslims, but also how Blacks and these informants that I've been working on fit into how we explain and how we talk about race in general. And I've always seen and looked at Jewish studies as a field where upon which I leaned to not only to think about xenophobia, to think about Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and racism. So now that I'm here, let me begin this short note by asking the following question: How do we teach race and racism as scholars of Jewish studies through ethnographic vignettes and historical accounts from North and Sub-Saharan Africa? What lessons can students of the field learn from constructions of race or the reality of race in North and Sub-Saharan Africa? So before I propose a few modest ideas to this panel, I want to caution against reading race as well as social and cultural dynamics of racism in North Africa through the same European and American model of analysis, where race is often seen in terms of genetics. Of course, I am not saying that there is nothing to learn from these links, otherwise there is no need to me today. I want to start by underlining the fact that there is a lot to learn from teaching of race in the field of Jewish studies through North African Jewish and non-Jewish groups in their construction of race. I believe that Jewish studies can learn from racial concepts in the region in the same way the field benefited from historical and anthropological works on Jewish-Muslim relations. Jewish intellectuals were players, with no doubt, to some extent, in the construction of racial Jewish typologies of North and Sub-Saharan Africa. Nonetheless, or nevertheless, what remains dominant in these constructions is what I call, and I quote here, the cultural and civilizational whitening, especially of North African Jews, which is the result of Jewish emancipation in Western Europe, and the differentiating of European Jewries from their co-religionists on the southern shores of the Mediterranean. My mentor, Daniel Schroeder, eloquently captures the importance of this note, and I really encourage you to use his work and his article, The Orientalism and the Jews of the Mediterranean, because I think it summarizes some of these issues. But before I give a few examples, here is what I like to acknowledge, that the recent positive contributions of Jewish studies in America in terms of research and publication on Jews of North Africa, I think it's central to think about that as at least a foundation for thinking about these issues. So there's a lot of positive things to think about there. And I think that the discussion we are having now would not be possible without the growing corpus of works produced by scholars of diverse backgrounds and fields of knowledge. This growing scholarly literature has been key to our Jewish studies classrooms in and outside of the United States. We're beginning to understand the context of cultural whitening that has been central to the racial construction of North African Jews, including by Jewish intellectuals influenced by social Darwinism. And this enlarged, to some extent, the space for scholars to think about these conversations. As a teacher, I would like my students to think and about the construction of race in the context of North Africa through the intersection and boundaries of class, ethnicity, and religion. These are, for me, the three main important points. I think the fact that indigenous Berbers, or Amazigh to be exact, populations were religiously constructed as Jews, at least before Islam, has in North Africa has played a key role in the layering of ethnicity and religion. Of course, we should note that colonial France played a central role in the production of this knowledge of racial classification, and that in its syllabus should note this, at least to the student. As a scholar of Moroccan and North African Jews and other religious minorities in the region, one of the most intriguing racial discussions revolved around how Berbers, or Amazigh to be exact, were Judaized and Arabs were Islamized. I think the work of Hirschberg, Daniel Troiter, and others is really central to this conversation too. The racial connection between Jews and Berbers is one of the most important colonial articulations of race in North Africa, and I would argue that it survived the post-colonial period. And this is a dangerous moment, I think, that we see today in some of these discussions. Supported by colonial administrations, Nahum Slush himself was one of these champions. Therefore, by linking Jews to Berbers in the racial model, French sociologists, ethnographers of the colonial era made them white in comparison to Arabs, whose conquest of the region in the 7th century has turned the former into a culturally impure group. One example that highlights this idea is the Kahina. So we see a lot, this is a story that a lot of people have written about, the Jewish Berber queen who fought Arab conquerors in the early Islamic stages. While the Kahina's Jewishness remains in question, I believe that the symbolic significance of this assigned Berberness, both in medieval and modern times, could be of significance to how we discuss these racial constructions. And my colleague, the work of Abdelmajid Hanoum is, I would say, pertinent here. My second reflection, and I would close quickly here, is related to the emerging discourse of remembering of what I call the ratio-religious fetishizing of what's called the lost tribes of Israel in sub-Saharan Africa, which involves Jewish constructions of self in Africa. This trend has also been led by scholars in Europe, in the United States, like Tudor Parfit from Florida International University, and indirectly sponsored by organizations like Kulanu. I perceive that these claims of Jewish memory and heritage as a new racial invention that is formalized through outside organizations like Kulanu to whiten some African blacks through racialized celebration of their Jewishness. For instance, in May 1996, Zakor, an association in Mali, would argue that Jews, or at least claim that Jews are, that these recent Jews or indigenously invented Jews, their ancestors were Jews and that they were ethnically with genes, and the quote I quote here, with Jewish genes. So this trend of social thinking through the invention of a Jewish tradition is now the topic of anthropological work, and I would invite you to look at the recent work of Noah Tamarkin to work on the limba. So to conclude, I want to stress here that the construction of lineage to the Prophet Muhammad is similarly used in Mauritania to argue that some Black Africans by appearance are actually Bidan or white by lineage. I see this as a lineage triumphing over physical and physiological appearance, bearing in mind that genetic transmission and lineage are technically distinct and genetics is not part of the traditional knowledge. It means that the traditional construction of identity is fluid and regularly used to meet ideological needs until today. So the other cautionary note I want to stress here is that DNA studies and biological anthropological works on Berbers and Black Jews, quote unquote, have been part of this tradition of racial logic that try to separate Jews and Muslims, not as religious entities, but as distinct cultural groups with different genetic origins. It is this logic that guides today some political debates in North Africa between Amazigh and Arab activists driven by racial ideologies influenced by colonial discourse, which re-advances and redefines today Amazigh as Jews again. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. We're going to go quickly now to Ben for a response to that question.
Sure, and thank you again, everyone, for having me to this important event. So I'm going to share, I'll start by sharing a bit of my own intellectual genealogy because I think it's really relevant here. So I was an undergraduate student in Black Studies at Northwestern University, and that was really where I began to think about race and colonialism and anti-racism and white supremacy in a really kind of critical way. And I wasn't really at that moment interested in Jewish studies, but I remember being in Richard Eiten's, the late great Richard Eiten's introductory course on diaspora, and sort of suddenly these light bulbs going off and hearing these words that I had heard in my life before, like diaspora, like exile, like minority. And I, at some point along the way in my studies in Black studies, I began to really kind of re-articulate my own understanding of and relationship with Jewish identity, Jewish culture, what I knew of Jewish history through the prism of Black studies. And so I really began to ask questions about exile and difference, about assimilation and racial oppression, but from, I think, a different epistemological viewpoint than most places where these discussions begin in Jewish studies. So I was not only thinking about anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness together, but also situating the former in a different frame, really foregrounding racial capitalism and the colonial world system, rather than simply comparing discrete histories of sort of anti-Semitic oppression in Europe and anti-Black oppression in the Americas or in Africa. So that's really which led to my research today. And in my dissertation research, I'm really looking at how Black intellectuals, primarily in the United States and the French Empire, were reflecting on the rise of Nazism in the 1930s. And what really emerges from that research is a very complex and ambivalent field across which elements of anti-Semitism and white supremacy and fascism reproduce idiosyncratically. And what that demonstrates for me, or the importance of that research really, right, is that we're really seeing how anti-Semitism and white supremacy are not just these analogous forms. They're not just two different forms of the same thing, but they're really entangled in complex ways, and they require really careful consideration. And on the other hand, what I try to do in that work is really think about Jewish history, the history of the Holocaust and the history of anti-Semitism from the perspective of these Black scholars and Black intellectuals, right? So the point is less of like putting one Jewish thinker aside with a Black thinker, or non-Jewish Black thinker, or one, European Jewish writer against a Black American non-Jewish writer, right? And doing a kind of one-to-one comparison, but just really seeing what comes out of Black studies, what comes out of Black thought, what comes out of Black literature if we allow ourselves to look at the history of anti-Semitism or the history of the Holocaust in particular from that perspective. And then the last point I'll just say in my teaching, of course, then the questions of race are front and center. I teach history of anti-Semitism, I teach history of the Holocaust, and sort of the question of racial hierarchies, racial ideologies, the questions of racial colonialism, all are really central into the ways that I teach that and the way I ask questions about where anti-Semitism really comes from.
Thank you. Lila, would you like to jump in on this one?
Sure, thanks so much. I do just want to start that there's something about the fact that you guys have pulled together this forum and are starting this conversation that feels like this strange mix of incredible bravery and absolute necessity. And I'm just like being struck by that because, in a certain sense, like I feel, I'll admit, like a bit of trepidation about how to talk about this. How do I positioned as I am, you know, as a tenured faculty person, as a white person, as a Jewish person, as a woman, enter this conversation. And so I feel some of that, and I also feel this incredible necessity to be in this conversation and how one grapples with that. So I just appreciate this opportunity. And in listening to the other panelists, a lot of the different pieces that I've heard really intersect with some of the ways that in my own research, in my own teaching, I've been thinking about ideas of Jewishness and race. Sultan, you use this incredible phrase, finding race when it's not named. And I was thinking also sometimes looking at something when it is named as race and asking exactly what that means. And I think that in my work on American Jewish history, there are plenty of times when, you know, specifically in the 19th century, when American Jews were using a vocabulary of race, specifically that word. And it's been really a scholarly puzzle to tease out, is that usage of the word race more analogous perhaps to how we would use ethnicity? And what does that mean? Is it more analogous to talking about nationality or nationalism in some way? But then the second piece of finding race when it's not named has become really interesting to me, because I've just started research on ideas of Jewish citizenship in the United States. And I would not have thought that that there would be any there, right? Jews came to the United States and were emancipated into citizenship. They could become citizens. There was no process. It was very different from other places where they had lived, where emancipation was this whole struggle. This was the narrative that I certainly had always learned. You know, and if you go back to the 1790 naturalization laws of when the United States was crafting its policies of citizenship, they specifically say that any alien, being a free white person, can become a citizen. And I've certainly read that law before and thought a lot about it, and never thought about its particular implication for Jews. And the fact that when Jews came, whether they'd been in the United States prior to the American Revolution or they came afterwards, they fit under that naturalization law in many circumstances, with just a few exceptions, that they were recognized as being free and white, and thus being able to be citizens. And yet over time, the sort of ground of what it meant to be a citizen in this country shifted, right? And there's the elaboration of the, you know, amendments that are passed at the time of the Civil War that put the idea of race, in fact, front and center, right? Having to name explicitly that if somebody is of a different race, this does not necessarily preclude their ability to be citizens. And in a certain sense, when citizenship and whiteness starts to be a little bit pulled apart, not entirely, right, let's be clear, but when it starts to be a little bit pulled apart in the kind of legal conception of citizenship, it becomes a different kind of problem for American Jews, right? When citizenship is not necessarily a signification of being free and white, and in certain cases male, you get more and more questions among American Jews about what their racial status is. And I have found that perplexing, right? I have found that really an occasion to try to understand what are the kinds of racial ideologies under which American law is operating and under which American Jews are operating. And I found particular moments in case law about American citizenship that alight upon the figure of the Jew and ask very specific questions, especially about loyalty, right? What does it mean when an American Jew goes to Palestine pre-statehood and spends a lot of time there? Does that Jew cede his or her nationality, right? And in fact, a lot of questions about dual loyalty and dual citizenship in the United States, and the most important Supreme Court case about that are set upon the figure of the Jew who has spent time in Palestine and then Israel. And so these questions are striking me in new and different ways with my research into citizenship. And that to me is really about looking at this kind of, foundation of the field of American Jewish history, which is that, one thing that's very different in the United States is Jews simply could be citizens, and having to pull that apart along these kinds of lines of ideologies about race, and especially ideas of white supremacism, which I'm interested in talking about later.
Thank you so much. And much of what you said, I think, is going to come up later in this conversation, especially this point about the epistemologies of race that change over time. But I want to get to Max too. I wanted to hear from Max and find out about your overall approach to this topic. And remember, the question was, how does your scholarship or teaching involve themes of race, racism, or anti-racism? Let's hear what Max has to say.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. Thanks, Lila. And thank you, everyone. I'm really honored to be with this group of fantastic colleagues. So part of my motivation for being on this panel was to show, similar to Ben, how my training in Chicana and Chicano and Central American studies has really given me incredibly useful tools to ask new questions and write new histories that consider how American spaces, and I say American in the broad hemispheric sense, have racialized Jewish subjects. So I use frameworks such as racial geographies and settler colonialism to teach us how to consider the Jewish relationship to land in the Americas as a window into Jewish race formation in the Americas. So similar to what Sultan mentioned, how do we trace race when race is not explicitly mentioned? I look at the Jewish relationship to land to answer some of those questions. And a quick note that my research focuses on Jewish race formation amongst non-Black Jews in the Americas. So specifically, I look at the US-Mexico border region as this really fruitful and critical space from which Jewish absorption into whiteness has unfolded between the colonial period through the present day. And the space between the American Southwest and northern Mexico has been fused through centuries of intersecting and competing space-making endeavors. And this begins in the 16th century with Spanish colonization, Mexican nation building in the early 19th century, and finally the Anglo occupation of the quote, American West in the mid-19th century. And these colonizing processes were indeed in competition with each other, but they were united around what scholar Patrick Wolf calls the settler colonial imperative of indigenous elimination to make land available for white settlers. So when we locate Jewish presence and integration within a white space-making process, such as the US-Mexico border, it clarifies how both Spanish and Anglo-settler colonial projects in the Americas have shaped Jews' relationship to land, often positioning them to replace native populations through their roles as white settlers. And across my teaching and writing, I poked to multiple examples of how this plays out, and I thought of three that I'd like to share today between the colonial period and the present, at three pivotal moments of violent space-making in the border region to show how Ashkenazi and Sephardic immigrants to the Americas, as well as US-born Jews, are positioned as valuable white settlers on stolen land from peoples living under policies of genocide for centuries. Now, Dean, I'm going to ask, I have these three examples and I might be able to better unpack them once we get to our second question about epistemologies and methodologies. So I'll pause for now, and I look forward to answering the second question.
Right on, thank you. Well, let's go right to the second question, which is, what are some of the epistemological and methodological blind spots in Jewish studies? What is Jewish studies having to learn about race, or what has it not yet learned about race that it really needs to, epistemologically or methodologically? You want to jump in on that, Max, since you're already kind of primed up for it?
Sure, thank you. I think pauses are useful on Zoom. So these are some examples of how settler colonialism as a framework is really useful for understanding the Jewish relationship to whiteness in the context of the US-Mexico border region. So part of my teaching is I start with the colonial period of Spanish occupation in the Americas as this opportunity to learn how Spanish and Portuguese immigrants of Sephardic heritage are being positioned as white settlers and beneficiaries of indigenous elimination. And specifically, we can look at the history of the encomienda system, which is considered one of the first race-based forced labor systems in the Americas, a proto-plantation style system it has been written about, and its reliance on indigenous land theft and enslavement. And under the system, encomenderos, or Spanish and Portuguese landowners, were given stolen land by the Spanish crown, given native labor, in exchange for overseeing indigenous cultural and religious westernization, right? Through a process of conversion and Spanishization through language and culture. And the historical record shows that some conversos, or new Christians of Sephardic heritage, were positioned as land-owning overseers of indigenous enslavement under the encomienda system, right? And we saw this system also in the northern reaches of New Spain, present-day US-Mexico border region. Another example I point to is in the era of Anglo-manifest destiny and Western expansion across the 19th century, and how this reveals how US policies of indigenous land theft were benefiting white settlers to the new American West, and this included, in some cases, German and Polish Jewish immigrants. One example I point to in my writing is in the mid-19th century, this policy known as the Indian Depredations Claim System, which gave white settlers to the American West these legal avenues to combat indigenous strategies of settler colonial resistance. So under this system, if a white settler could prove that they suffered a loss of land or resources at the hands of Native individuals or communities, the US government would reorient funds, federal funds, from Native communities to pay white settlers essentially reparations. And my research has shown examples of German Jewish families, specifically in the Arizona territories, benefiting from such policies in the mid-19th century. And now a present day example, which feels extremely urgent to, I hope, all of us, is this era of border wall militarization and fortification between Southwest and Northern Mexico. And border fortification reveals how white immigrant settlers' ancestral claims to land are continually being legally protected, while indigenous ones are denied and literally being destroyed. And the way I've seen this play out myself with my own eyes and then following through social media is through border wall fortification between Arizona and the Mexican state of Sonora. And there is a 20th century Jewish site of memory known as the Bisbee Douglas Cemetery in Douglas, Arizona, that sits merely 20 yards from the border fence. And it has been deemed worthy of preservation and even restoration, while 70 miles west, the 16,000-year-old ancestral burial ground of the Tohono O'odham peoples that resides within the Organ Pipe National Monument is being destroyed in the name of an imminent national threat and security needs requiring border wall fortification. So I just want to remind us all why settler colonialism as a framework is useful in this case. We see how a central tenet of settler colonial societies is the government's commitment to preserving the ancestral ties to land for white immigrants and settlers through erasing the histories of the land's original inhabitants. Right? So I'm not saying that Jewish sites of memory are not worthy of preservation and restoration, absolutely, but when we put these two vastly different approaches and ways of protecting land within US settler society, we see very, very different relationships to land being valorized.
Well, you know, Max, one of the things you're really pointing out too, to get above the particular claims you're making, is that what you're saying is only evident through a comparative methodology. You know, and so part of the question is about the methodologies in Jewish studies that either are emergent or maybe are in necessity of remediation. And many of our panelists, in fact, are comparativists. And this is a really new approach in Jewish studies. I want to pivot to Ben, who is also doing, in reference to his interest in comparative work. Can you say a bit too, Ben, about how you're going about doing the comparative work that you do? Because it's a deep comparison, as you described it, at the epistemic level.
Yeah, you know, I think that, so part of my work in that it comes into Jewish studies from kind of a back door, you could say, is that you really do see kind of differences in ways of learning and ways of studying that are invested in the racial status quo or not, and I'll just name it, and really I notice invested in what I would call the liberal center. And I think that, so like before, yeah, so I think that on the one hand, there's really just a very basic literacy problem that I want to name in terms of Jewish studies being an insular field and not just reading some basic, what I think are basic texts of ethnic studies, post-colonial studies, whatever it may be, outside of the field. And that just really is apparent, I've noticed. And at the same time, this alignment and difficulty separating oneself from kind of the liberal norms that are so powerful. So I think that actually some self-definitions of the fields are actually quite instructive here. So I'll just mention this briefly, but it's a great example. In 1966, in the American Jewish Yearbook, Arnie Band, whose work is foundational to studies of Jewish literature and is the founding father of Jewish studies at UCLA, defined Jewish studies as the, quote, discipline which deals with the historical experiences in the intellectual, religious, and social spheres of the Jewish people in all centuries and countries. And he noted the spread of Jewish studies as an accepted academic discipline in the American liberal arts colleges and universities since the Second World War. So this is 1966, right? So this is before the Afro-American Student Union at UC Berkeley demanded a Black Studies department, right? And yet already we see that Jewish studies has no problem coalescing inside the American university. Now, in contrast, right, Black studies emerged out of a very clear political fight and political demand. And C.L.R. James, one of the foundational historians of Black studies, really defined early in 1970 Black studies as the intervention of a neglected area of studies that are essential to the understanding of ancient and modern society. And he went on to assert that Black studies requires a complete reorganization of the intellectual life and the historical outlook of the United States and world civilization as a whole. So in that sense, the discipline, you know, of Black studies is seeking to make a fundamental intervention in and against normative understandings of society. Whereas, at least as reflected in that statement by Arnie Band, which I think is pretty still prevalent today, Jewish studies really does not see itself in those terms. It has a much more kind of detached empirical gaze on Jewish subjects, right, and doesn't necessarily think about the intervention that it wants to make. So that's part of the comparative thrust of my project, right, which is what happens to the way we understand anti-Semitism and the Holocaust if we look at it from the perspective of Black studies, which is to say a perspective that is trying to make a critical intervention into the normative ways of thinking about Western civilization and certainly the normative ways that we understand Western history. And so the one point that I'll say that my dissertation specifically in that comparative sense works with is rethinking the very conception of racism. So the concept of racism that's really dominant in Jewish studies is one that draws on really how the concept was developed in the post-war period. And it really, in that sense, it reflects a stigmatizing critique of Nazi Germany, right? The idea was Nazi Germany, sort of the urtext of racism, right? And in that sense, racism is this kind of abnormal, irrational, pathological deviation from an otherwise enlightened and civilized West. Now, such a conception, which characterizes Nazi race science as out of the ordinary, was obviously in the interests of the victors, right? That is the capitalist nation states and empires that had operated systems of racial subjugation and continued to do so before and after the war. So by making Nazism the site of racism par excellence, these victors then save themselves from indictment, right? And so what I see in my research, and then, you know, the concept of racism ends up getting really bogged down in sort of these ideas of individual prejudice and discrimination, right? It's really this individual problem that we're going to solve individually with education, right? Really neutering a lot of the systemic demands made by different social movements. But what I find in my research from these Black writers and intellectuals who are thinking about the rise of Nazism in the 30s and 40s is they're not thinking about Nazism as out of the ordinary, right? They're thinking about Nazism as unfortunately very ordinary in the landscape of racial subjugation and exploitation in the West. And that really, really reorients the way we think about the history of the Holocaust, the way the Holocaust relationship with other forms of violence, especially colonial violence, So I'll leave it at that for my answer.
Sultan, did you have something to add to this conversation in particular about methodology?
Yeah, several things. I mean, the answers are always so rich. There's a lot to say, but I will try to keep it short. In terms of methodology, I mean, look, I came to Jewish studies later. I actually came to Jewish studies with my postdoc at the Elie Wiesel Center, but I grew up basically with 6 million dead Jews in Germany. And they were present because there was a boom when I came of age. There was a boom, like a Holocaust memory boom, a post-Cold War boom, a memorialization boom. And all these shifts also brought changes in citizenship law for, you know, former guest workers, migrants. They could become German citizens, you know, like actually Lila's point about, you know, what is naturalization in the US context and how Jews are just considered white people who can naturalize and become American citizens, which is kind of like so unusual and exceptional to like all the experience before, right? So it kind of allows for a certain shift for a certain group to become normalized when we speak about naturalization, right? So this is kind of the background through which I came to like my questions, which in the context of Germany, you know, when these guest workers, when these former migrants started naturalizing, they became Muslims. And then fast forward 6 years later, in between there was September 11 and a whole discourse of Islamic extremism, and in a sense that, you know, they're intolerant, they're illiberal, they're anti-Semitic, they need all this like extremism combat program. And as I said, you know, like this is a context where race doesn't exist, partly because the way the Holocaust is memorialized, the way, you know, the figure of the 6 million stands in liberal democracy in Germany, it's like something, the price for an evil ideology was already paid by this figure of the 6 million dead Jews. And so talking about race, I had to understand through my field work, and here I come to like Max's earlier point about the cemetery, like the kind of land, kind of heritage that is worthy of preservation, and the kind of land that can just like wither away or just like is actually in the way. I've understood that, you know, being racialized more than racism itself, racism in the German context is kind of always given to the right wing, always given to the margins, to the extremists, to the ill-intentioned and prejudiced. And then there is no race, which there was in the Hitler era. But racialization, if you understand the work that racialization does, and this is like basically how I came to my understanding, you understand that a certain group is closer to death than the rest. So they can be treated unequally, they can be excluded, they can be, you can go into their neighborhoods, you can consume their food, you can, you know, live among them, but you will definitely not send your own children to the same school with their children. You will think of them as like, you know, maybe they're multilingual, but the other language they speak, they're not worth, that language is not worth much. So I had to understand what race is really for me different than ethnicity and religion. And I'm not saying that this racial structuration stands for itself. I think I agree with Aomar that, you know, class goes in there, religion goes in there, but a larger process of turning a certain group through wider policies, laws, social processes, the way we relate to them as a group that you can get rid of. And, you know, like their death is like almost normal. They die all the time, right? Or like they're not part of this anyway, right? Or they don't really do that anyway, right? Like this kind of like micro exclusion that goes in like several layers. I think this is what race stands for me. And the interesting thing that I think I bring to Jewish studies and that I have learned that I bring to Jewish studies is that I could show in my work, look, this is happening when we talk about Muslims, about a heterogeneous group of people. But in fact, some of the things we talk about here about Muslims, they implicate Jews in a certain way. And then they make this whole affair of racialization quite complex and embarrassing for the German public. So let's think about the circumcision affair. Let's think about kosher or halal slaughtering, right? Or like depicting something that touches religious sensibilities, not just Muslim religious sensibilities, but that could be, offensive also for Jewish sensibilities. So where does this lead me to? That, okay, we've gotten rid of this term race, but the way we racialize certain communities is quite alive and effective.
There's another question that you are all leading us to, which is how anti-Semitism is entangled with regimes of, at large, anti-Blackness or larger regimes of racism, both in the United States and North Africa and in Europe. So I want to get to that question now too. I thought we would start with Lila and then maybe ask Aomar to address this as well. How do we think about the history of anti-Semitism in relation to histories of white supremacy? Can we address that in this US context, and then we'll talk about it in other contexts as well?
Yeah, it's a really hard puzzle. And in fact, because I think it's so puzzling and hard and, sort of deeply tied to our political moment, I actually tried to just like, in a very like non-academic way, simplify, right? And set out some kind of progression that maybe can help us think about this. So I offer this as perhaps a tool, right? So the first point of this progression, one, is that in America, Jews are white. Of course, some are not, right? But that this is a perceptual reality of Jewishness in the United States. It is a perceptual reality of whiteness, point one. Point two, white Jews in the United States have had access to stores of privilege that have been reserved for white Americans, right? These include things having to do with citizenship, capitalism, democracy, right? A democracy is about who fits into who's represented by that, individualism, and collective rights. That's two. Three, these privileges that I just enumerated have given Jews opportunities to access something that we should call white power. This includes power over other people, and those other people have sometimes been other Jews, especially Jews who have had less access to privilege, including women and Jews of lower classes, Jews perceived as non-white. And those people have often been people who have less access to white privilege. So that's three, about privilege. Four, white power has positioned Jews, like other white Americans, in proximity to ideologies of white supremacism. And those ideologies include slave ownership and other forms of labor exploitation, including wage slavery, include colonialism, right? And Max has given us incredible fodder for talking about garnishment of land and property from indigenous populations, and also ideologies of policing having to do with violence and incarceration. So that's four. There's only like three more points. Five, however, a core component of white supremacism excludes Jews. White supremacism is a much narrower ideology than white privilege or white power. And Jews exercise white power and white privilege. But even as white supremacism rests upon those two pieces, white power and white privilege, Jews are not included in white supremacism because it advances an ethno-nationalist vision. It can be seen in immigration law and citizenship practices at various moments, and it makes clear that for Jews, citizenship in the United States was not an all or nothing affair. And white supremacism is concerned about threats to white predominance, apparent threats from non-whites and less apparent ones from whites who don't maintain the value of white supremacism, leftists, socialists, communists, and Jews. So six, in other words, that Jews are white is a threat to white supremacism. And I'm taking some of these ideas from a really important article that David Schraub published, and I want to mention that. And that the threat that Jews pose to white supremacism is not solved by protesting the classification of Jews as white. But an error I think that some make in my field is to read the fact that Jews are a threat to white supremacism as a way of concluding that Jews are therefore not white. I hope that makes sense. I can say more about it if you want. But instead, it's precisely the privilege that Jews gain through being white that issues the threat to white supremacism. If Jews were not white, they would not be a threat to the white supremacists. or they'd be a different kind of threat. And it's this fact that makes solidarity, whether with whites or with Black, Indigenous, and people of color, very, very tricky. And the last point 7 is that the problem of how to classify Jews then remains what I would call the Jewish question, and not just within academic circles. This is not just a methodological question about Jewish studies. How does the whiteness of Jews, which is no more real or stable than any other racist idea, make it incredibly difficult to classify Jews in the United States? They're excluded from a final test of whiteness, and yet they're part of the structuring work that whiteness does. Or maybe they're included if they're willing to conceive of their Zionism as an ethno-nationalism, separate but equal. And I just want to end by invoking what our president said in his Rosh Hashanah address or call with Jewish leaders. He said to them, "We really appreciate you. We love your country also," right? That is a solution to the Jewish question. And it allows white supremacism to stand in a much more easy relationship with Jewishness.
Well said. Thank you, Lila. The impressive thing about the field of Jewish studies is that it's international, and I wanted to pivot over to Aomar and ask if he could perhaps reframe this question about Jewish relationships to whiteness and Blackness in the context of his research in North Africa.
I think to build on what Lila mentioned, but also it's different here, especially in the context of the Middle East and North Africa. When you talk about this question of anti-Semitism in research as well as in terms of teaching, I think we still have to walk the road. I think we're still at the level of research and writing, and it has to do with ideological reasons. Why? Because Jewish studies, I think, and Holocaust studies to a large extent, for a longer time, they ignored the Muslim initiative against anti-Semitism. So it's just recently where we're now at a phase of research and preparing papers and books for the classroom. So that's where the work has to be done. That I think the unsilencing is working right now. Centers of Holocaust studies, centers for Jewish studies now are trying at least to rethink about these ideas. This is, and then also I think Jewish studies need to think about Arabic sources. There's a lot of material out there that has been written in the 40s, in the 50s, and post World War II on these topics, mostly in Arabic. And I think that's where the work, can Jewish studies also teach or Hebrew, but at the same time so allow for the teaching of Arabic and other languages to understand indigenous notions of not only race versus religion as far as Jewish studies is concerned, but also take that also to the level of how indigenous communities in North Africa, Muslims and non-Muslims, dealt with questions of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and xenophobia.
Thank you so much. I'd like to ask a more general question now. Hopefully all panelists can jump in on this one. The question is, how would you think Jewish studies ought to, as a field, engage with the project of abolitionism and engage with Black Lives Matter, or do the kind of anti-racist work that I think prompted us to have this panel in the first place? So what does Jewish studies as a field need to do? And you can answer that from your particular position within the field or where you sit on the boundaries, or perhaps from your own research, but let's hear what you have to say. Max, you want to go ahead first?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you for that question. And the news yesterday that the cops who murdered Breonna Taylor have again escaped meaningful and legal accountability for their actions really recentered this question for me. What is Jewish studies' current and future engagement and commitment with the movement for Black lives and abolition? And I'm grappling with what meaningful and material solidarity might look like within the context of the academy, as well as within a global context. And I look towards abolitionists, Black radical thinkers like Angela Davis, who remind us that local and national movements for liberation are inextricably connected to global ones. And for the Black Lives Matter movement, this means challenging and dismantling the prison industrial complex on an international stage. And one example of abolition in a global context is making explicit the militarization of the US police and the Israeli police, and the related criminalization and systemic elimination of Black and Brown Americans and Palestinians within that global context. And within this framework, Jewish studies would really need to interrogate its commitment to Palestinian liberation for there to be meaningful solidarity with the movement for Black lives. And this linking of the struggle for Black lives and Palestinian liberation is just one of multiple visions of abolitionist justice, right? It's one that I am grappling with myself, and undoubtedly it's going to be a constant and gradual struggle over time. And in this light, just to kind of build off this question that Dean posed, I'm interested in what more senior scholars on this panel, who are undoubtedly better equipped to speak to the administrative organizations and workings of Jewish studies departments, how might you envision meaningful solidarity with the movement for Black lives? And specifically, how might the privatization of higher education generally, and how it shaped Jewish studies specifically, shape the scope of meaningful engagement between Jewish studies and Black Lives Matter?
So I'll follow up on you, Max. I think that's a really great point. And I also want to circle back to the moment in terms of the lack of justice provided for Breonna Taylor and her family. I'll start though by saying that I really think a very first step, basic step that needs to happen is that Jewish studies needs to consider where its scholarship sits in relation to power. Like that is just like a very basic step, I think. And to illustrate this, I mean, for example, I mentioned the origins of Black studies institutionally, that is in the 60s. Of course, it's much older than that. But one of the most seminal texts of Black studies is, especially in a historical regard, is Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, and it includes the famous chapter on the propaganda of history, right? And so Du Bois in that chapter is really lacerating historians for distorting and contradicting the truth of history according to the wishes of those in power. And Du Bois's historiographic practice is really a corrective to that. So learning from that model, right, really thinking about in what ways does our scholarship reinscribe, reproduce, reify the systems of power as they are. Yesterday with the news from the Kentucky Attorney General that there was going to be no indictment of those two cops, right, what that really demonstrates, I think, is the fundamental incapacity of American liberal law to provide justice for Black people in this country, right? And so what that a specific question that raises is what kind of investments do American Jewish communities have and Jewish studies as a discipline have in liberal law as protection, as a progressive system, as the height of progress even maybe completely, right? And that is sort of where, that's the interrogation that I think needs to start. And then on the other regard, it's really how I think Jewish studies conceptualizes anti-Semitism and racism right together. And I mentioned a little bit about racial individualism before, but how there's an idea on the one hand, I think that's really dominant in Jewish studies, which just follows the sort of dominant idea of racism since the 1950s, which is that, racism is this personal problem of prejudice and hate and intolerance, right? And we just need more education on an individual level, right? So if that's your approach to racism, then there's going to be very serious obstacles in creating solidarity and joint struggle with the anti-racist groups that are foregrounding movements for Black liberation today, because they're proposing structural and abolitionist solutions, right? Abolition means abolishing this world, right? Are you prepared for that is a question that you really, I think, need to ask yourself when you're going into joint struggle. And then with anti-Semitism, right, still we see not only these ideas of prejudice, discrimination, hate, as sort of these defining synonyms for anti-Semitism, these psychological pathologizing terms, right? But we still see this sort of eternal approach to anti-Semitism, right? This idea that the history of anti-Semitism is this one long stream. Of course, there are historical differences, right? But we can really connect it all from, you know, I don't even know, the New Testament, maybe Pharaoh, right, all the way to today. And I think when you begin from that approach, then it's like, you're right. There's going to be a very difficult way to put that in the context of anti-racism, to think about anti-Semitism in the relationship to anti-Blackness. It's just so massive at that point. It's overwhelming, right? Which is why then I think, for me, the approach that I take to anti-Semitism that I think allows me to build in a meaningful anti-racist education into my teaching is really thinking about anti-Semitism specifically and historically as some kind of historical conjuncture between the historic, theological, and structural anti-Judaism of the West on the one hand, and the historical development of racial governance and discourses on the other. That anti-Semitism really represents the conjuncture of those two things. We don't have to choose between them, and we can really learn from them. You're just in a class of mine the other day on the history of anti-Semitism, one of my students, we were reading selections from David Nirenberg's Phenomenal Anti-Judaism, and one of my students, who is engaged in Black Studies, an undergraduate, mentioned that she had identified how similar certain arguments in his book was with certain kinds of Afro-pessimist discourse, and sort of really identifying the way in which anti-Blackness was kind of baked into the very structure of the West, that she sort of saw similar sorts of arguments in anti-Judaism, right? So those are the sorts of, I think, really, really productive pedagogical and scholarly connections that really we can explore, that open up pathways not only to see where we all stand in relation to power and where Jewish studies stands, but then to open up ways where we can make Jewish studies scholarship in conversation with other kinds of anti-racist critiques and approaches.
That was really bracing, Ben. Thank you. I want to turn to Lila. There's really nobody who's doing better research and scholarship right now on Jews and power and Jews at the nexus of power. And so I'd like you perhaps to tell us how you address Max's challenge and Ben's observations as well. And this will probably be the last comment from our panelists, given that we're just about out of time.
Yeah, Ben, that was fascinating. I was scribbling as you were speaking. And a piece I want to just pull out in the last couple of minutes we have is that it's really useful, and I hadn't thought about it in this way until you other folks were speaking, to think about like the genealogy of the field itself, and even going back earlier than the post-war period when you start to have Jewish studies being part of the American university, even thinking about 19th century sort of Jewish studies scholarship, it's been interested in a kind of integrative function, right? It's been interested in sort of bringing Jews into modernity, into the modern nation state, into the categories of scientific study of arts and literature and sciences. And so that integrative function has really continued to kind of be very forceful in terms of the organization of Jewish studies programs in the United States, certainly, right? Ideas about that in a sense, Jews are a case study, right? They're paradigmatic of X, Y, and Z, but also ideas, and I think this gets to some of the funding, that this is about Jews fitting in a certain way, right? And being able to kind of have that place at the, like, vaunted intellectual capital of the university, not by pushing too hard on anything, but by kind of exemplifying, by showing how progress can work, how what I think Ben really rightfully calls the kind of liberal center is a certain truth. And I'll end because I know Sarah is gonna bring us home. But I just want to say that I also think if we excavate, we find some radical undercurrents. And it's not just our task to create this anew whole cloth. I think that we have forebears who actually were advancing awfully radical critiques about that kind of liberal-oriented, integrative sort of progress, civilizational, colonizing, all of this. And it is also our task to find some of those voices and those radical undercurrents.
Wonderful. I scarcely know how to use my 60 seconds to wrap up this conversation, but I think perhaps the most fruitful way to do so is to begin first by thanking all of the panelists. A number of you spoke to the fact that the sets of questions that we put before you today were personal and delicate, and represent for some of you the first time that you are fully articulating them in a public realm and in a more casual realm. So we are so grateful for your dialogue and your bravery and your reflection in this regard. The second thing I want to say is that what strikes me so strongly from this conversation is that it is a beginning. And while I think Lila is right that there are radical undercurrents and histories to our field that warrant unpacking and highlighting, we seem to also be at a particular moment where Jewish studies is willing to engage in soul searching, in disciplinary field border crossing, indeed, to think about these borders as being artificial and far more porous than have ever been recognized before. And I think it is to our participants who, sadly, we didn't have time to take your questions and your comments and your engagement. I would say that for those of you who are working in other academic centers, we hope you will join us by carrying this conversation deeper and further, whether with us or within your own academic circles. So many thanks to the guests, to the staff who pulled off this event so beautifully, and thank you for joining our inaugural Levy Center event for the academic year, and we very much hope to see you at future online, live, and recorded events soon. Thanks so much.